You were never meant to hear this, not from the priests who sealed the chapel doors shut with wax and ash, not from the church archivists who burned the records under the name of sanctity, and certainly not from the last living descendant of Blackwood, who hanged himself in 1923 after carving one sentence into the floorboards. The bells still call the dead. In the winter of 1781, in the coldest edge of Yorkshire, where the wind moves like a curse and the fog tastes like bone dust, a sound began to rise from Blackwood church, tolling bell, deep and slow, echoing across the moor. But there was no hand on the rope, no priest in the tower, no weight to swing it. The villagers whispered that the bell rang itself. By the third night, something answered. Graves shifted in the churchyard, though the ground was frozen solid. Dogs refused to walk past the gate. Children began speaking in voices not their own. The bishop in York called it a trick of wind and mind, but Father Elias Thorn, a man without origin or parish, had arrived just months earlier with books bound in skin and a box sealed in lead. He replaced the parish priest without a word, introduced a new mass written in a language no one recognized, and whispered to the dying that resurrection was a promise, not a metaphor. The Sunday sermons grew strange hollow hymns sung in minor tones, communion that tasted of iron, and incense that made even the healthy faint in the pews. One widow claimed she saw her husband sitting beside her in the front row, 20 years dead and wearing the same soil-stained boots they buried him in. No one believed her until 6 more parishioners said the same. Then the bells rang at 3:33 a.m., 3 nights in a row, each time louder, each time closer. And then the dead began to return, not with screams, but with silence. 17 graves were later found disturbed, not from above but from below. The coffins cracked open from within, claw marks on the inside of the lids, and earth piled like something had crawled out. The church tried to hush it. They locked the records, excommunicated the witnesses, and sent an inquisitor named Benedict Crowe, who kept a journal they never wanted you to read. His last entry, scribbled in a hymnal soaked with blood, read only, "They weren't raising the dead, they were inviting them back." Whatever rang those bells didn't just summon spirits, it opened something, and once opened, it never closed again. What happened next was never entered into official church records, but the surviving pages of Father Crowe's journal, now hidden in a locked vault in Vatican archives, tell of a ritual that had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with control, resurrection, and submission to something older than God. Crowe arrived in Blackwood, days after the bells first rang without hands, expecting heresy, perhaps madness, but what he found was obedience. An entire village subdued by silence, eyes hollow, voices gone, as if something had drained them from within. He was greeted not with words but with stares, as children stood barefoot in frost-covered soil, watching him pass, and the once lively inn sat boarded, though candlelight flickered through cracks. Inside the church, he found Elias Thorn kneeling before the altar, whispering into the lead box that had been buried beneath it. Crowe demanded an explanation, but Thorn simply turned and said, "The door is open now. We only listen." That night, Crowe heard the bells again, closer this time, and louder, though the belfry was empty. In his journal, he described walking through the graveyard at dawn and finding the soil over a dozen graves freshly disturbed, despite the ground being frozen hard as stone. Then came the villagers' ice, each of them ringed with grey, unfocused, like sleepwalkers who'd forgotten how to wake. Crowe tried to hold mass the following morning, but no one responded to the readings. Instead, the congregation stood in perfect silence and began humming not a hymn, but a droning sound, low and ancient, like the buzzing of hornets in a tomb. He collapsed at the altar, clutching his ears, and later wrote, "It wasn't a song, it was a command. Not from God, not from man, but something beneath." That same night, he found Thorn and 3 parishioners digging in the church cellar, unearthing a sealed stone archway buried beneath layers of ash and salt. "This was here before the church," Thorn said, eyes wild. "Before England, before the cross." Crowe tried to stop them, but Thorn whispered a single phrase. Crowe felt his body freeze, his limbs heavy as iron, his voice gone. The door beneath the altar began to tremble, and the bells rang again. That was when the change spread, first the animals, then the infants. Birds dropped from the sky mid-flight. Goats birthed stillborns with human teeth. Newborns stopped crying and stared, unblinking, into corners of empty rooms. It wasn't just death that answered the bells. It was something older, something waiting. Crow tried to flee, but the roads had vanished literally. The dirt path leading out of Blackwood now ended in mist, the trees unfamiliar, as though the land itself had shifted. "They've bent the boundary," he wrote. "This is no longer Yorkshire. This is the place between." One morning, the bell rang 13 times at sunrise. Crow returned to the graveyard and found every headstone reversed, names gone, dates replaced with symbols that made his skin burn to read. That night, he heard footsteps in the church long after Thorn had disappeared, and when he entered the nave, he saw them, figures kneeling in the pews, faces veiled, skin grey, robes soaked in earth. They turned, slowly, not as the living do, but like dolls rotated by invisible hands. He ran. He hid in the vicar's quarters, sealing the door with holy water and prayers he no longer believed. The next entry in his journal was a confession. This church was built on a gate. The bells are its key. They do not warn the living. They summon the forgotten. And still, he stayed, because he had to witness what no man should. But this story doesn't end in Blackwood. The bells rang in Yorkshire. Yes, but their echo reached farther, crossing oceans, seeding similar rituals in other parishes, in other silent chapels, from Salem to Strasbourg, from Boston to Bath. Something was loosed in 1781, and the church didn't just let it happen. They orchestrated it. By the time the bells fell silent in Yorkshire, the infection had already spread, though not of the body, but of the mind, of the spirit, a sickness transmitted through sound, through silence, through ritual. It moved like a shadow cast over altars and confession booths, cloaked in Latin and guilt, leaving no fever, no blood, only obedience. In 1782, less than a year after Blackwood vanished from the map scrubbed from official charts, its records lost in a fire. At the diocesan registry, a near identical event occurred in a rural village outside Salem, Massachusetts. There too, the bells rang without hands. There too, parishioners spoke in tongues they'd never learned, drew symbols into the snow with their bare feet, and claimed to see their ancestors walking through the graveyard at dawn. The local priest, Father Reuben Cask, had received correspondence from a man identifying himself only as E.T. The letters contained instructions: burn the old scriptures, bury salt at the foot of the pulpit, recite the Gospel of Mark backwards at dusk for 7 nights. Cask obeyed, and on the 8th day, 13 parishioners vanished during Mass, leaving behind only their shoes, arranged neatly in the pews. There was no fire, no attack. They were simply gone. And the bells continued to ring. Centuries later, in 1974, a declassified Vatican memorandum surfaced briefly before being pulled from public archives. Own line stood out: the bell-based initiations remain active across former Blackwood-affiliated sites. Seals hold in most locations, but residual awakenings have occurred. Residual awakenings. That's how they refer to it now. Not resurrections, not possessions, but awakening souls reactivated, identities rewritten, memory no longer bound to flesh or time. And if that sounds like madness, consider this. In 1843, a mass grave was uncovered in Strasbourg beneath a convent cellar. 43 bodies, all dressed in clerical robes, all with tongues removed and bells bound to their wrists with iron twine. No explanation, no record, only a stone tablet above the chamber reading, "When the veil thins, they will walk again." The connection between these sites isn't architectural, it's tonal. The bells are tuned to a frequency lost to modern ears, a vibrational pattern closer to breath than sound, embedded with sequences meant to bypass conscious resistance. Thorn knew this. Crow uncovered it, and the church used it. Because the bells were never meant to summon the faithful, they were designed to program them. Ancient texts recovered from beneath the Vaticanthe Codex Resonus, allegedly translated from a pre-Babylonian dialect, describe rituals using harmonic structures to separate the self from the soul, to create gaps in memory, obedience without awareness. This wasn't worship, it was compliance. A system older than Christ, older than Rome, repackaged in robes and incense, designed not to lift you toward heaven, but to lower you into silence. Ask yourself this: why do so many cathedrals share the same bell frequencies across continents, built in eras that supposedly had no contact? Why were early heretics burned for reciting certain songs of opening? And why were so many demonic possessions centered around sound spells, chants, whispered invocations rather than symbols or artifacts? Because sound bypasses the rational. It enters you before you can stop it. And Blackwood was the prototype. But by now, this isn't just history, it's architecture, it's liturgy, it's in your city, your neighborhood, maybe even your Sunday service. They never stopped the ritual, they just changed the lyrics. And you, yes, you hearing this now, you were never supposed to. Because to hear it is to remember. To remember is to awaken. And once awakened, you can never go back to sleep. In 1781, the bells of Blackwood, had rung by accident, a supernatural anomaly, an unfortunate tear in the veil, but they were wrong. It wasn't a malfunction, it was a signal, a test of mass psychological influence, conducted under the perfect cover of divine ritual, and the results were more effective than they could have imagined. After Crow vanished, presumed dead, the church quickly deployed a replacement investigator, Father Thomas Rook, a Jesuit with a background in acoustics and linguistic programming, but even his notes, found decades later buried in a locked drawer in St. Anselm's Seminary, read more like a horror novel than a report. He claimed the church architecture itself was designed to trap frequencies, that Thorn had installed hidden brass resonators behind the altar that hummed softly during prayer, emitting a frequency just above the range of conscious hearing, enough to alter heartbeat, breath, rhythm, and thought patterns. Rook recorded strange incidents, parishioners freezing in place mid-hymn, whispering to the walls, bleeding from the ears without pain, collapsing in ecstasy at the exact moment the bell rang 13 times. He wrote, "This is not faith, it is possession without demons." But the church didn't destroy the site. They studied it. They took what worked, erased what frightened them, and spread the model to isolated villages across Europe. In 1803, a nearly identical structure was discovered in rural Italy beneath a monastery near Cremona, housing a choir chamber that, when activated by wind or breath alone, produced the same tonality as the Blackwood bells. There too, villagers had vanished. There too, graves had been opened. There too, records had been lost intentionally. Because here is what they don't want you to realize. It was never about summoning the dead. It was about learning how to bring them back on command. Not as ghosts, but as vessels. Hollowed out forms with the appearance of life, the memory of death, and the obedience of a servant. They called them echoes. And once you've seen an echo, you understand why people go mad trying to describe them. In 1829, a scientist working under Vatican sponsorship in Prague wrote of a subject who returned from a 4-day death after exposure to bell harmoniche, had no heartbeat, no breathing, but he stood, answered questions, even smiled, until he was asked his name, and he said, "Which one?" The project was shut down. The scientist disappeared, but the notes remained, hidden, leaked, forgotten until now. And here's where you, the listener, must decide whether to keep going, because what comes next isn't history, it's presence. You've already heard the frequencies. They live in the structure of this world, in the design of your schools, your churches, your anthems, even the apps that ping your phone in just the right tone to hold your attention. This isn't magic, it's engineering. And the Blackwood bells were just the beginning. If you're still here, comment below. The bells remember me. Say it twice. Let the watchers know you've seen behind the veil. Let them know you're not asleep anymore. They called it the doctrine of harmonic resurrection in the hidden text fragments of parchment found stitched into the spine of a 14th century Bible hidden in Durham Cathedral, now missing from public display after a fire that curiously destroyed nothing except that single shelf. And the doctrine claimed this, that human consciousness could be untethered, stretched, and refitted using sound, that identity was not fixed but programmable through tonal sequences known only to certain high clergy and ancient brotherhoods buried beneath the visible church. Blackwood was not a mistake, it was a proof of concept, and Thorn wasn't acting alone. He was part of a lineage aged in whispers through the Order of the Veiled Star, a sect older than the Vatican, possibly older than Christianity itself, with roots deep in the Mithraic mysteries, Babylonian priestcraft, and something darker still, something that never had a name, only a sound, 4 tones, always the same, found on cave walls in Yorkshire, on altars in Sardinia, and on the teeth of skeletons unearthed in silent catacombs below Munich. Those tones, when rung in the correct sequence, said, "Oh, not awaken memory." They replace it. In 1781, the Blackwood bells rang those tones, and the people of that village began forgetting who they were. Children no longer recognized their parents. Men came home and stared at their wives like strangers. One woman claimed her newborn changed faces each night, and her husband agreed. It wasn't possession, it was transference, the overlay of one life onto another, like rewriting parchment by burning the original. The church called it hysteria. The record said flu. But the bells kept ringing, and each time they rang, the people forgot a little more. And into those gaps, something else crept, in something cold, something ancient, something patient. Crow's recovered pages described a figure seen during the final week, tall, faceless presence in the back pew of the church, unmoving, shrouded in black. It never spoke, it never blinked. But every time the bells tolled, its head would tilt slightly, as if listening. One villager was found dead, with his face turned toward the tower, lips torn open as if screaming something unspeakable into the wind. When the bishop saw the body, he said only, "We warned them not to ring all 4. Because here's the secret that never made it to print. Church bells across Europe are tuned to one of 4 ancient harmonic frequencies, and never are all 4 supposed to be rung in the same place, at the same hour. Blackwood did. And what came through wasn't meant to be here. That's why they buried it, why they erased the village, raised the foundation, and turned the land into grazing pasture with no marker, no record, no memory. But bells leave echoes. Sound never truly dies. And even now, travelers passing through that quiet stretch of Yorkshire claim to hear faint ringing at dusk, followed by whispers from the hedgerows, voices that sound like someone they lost, someone who should be dead, calling them by name in a tongue they've never heard but somehow understand. These are not ghosts. They are the residue of a ritual that never closed, a door that was opened and left ajar. And the real question isn't what happened at Blackwood. It's how many more churches carry that same sound. How many more towers are waiting for someone to ring the last forbidden tone? In 1807, 26 years after the Blackwood bells first rang, a low-ranking clerk in London's ecclesiastical archive, Thomas Albridge, discovered an unmarked envelope containing a wax-sealed letter and a brass tuning fork, engraved with the coordinates of a now non-existent village in Yorkshire. He struck the fork out of idle curiosity, and the sound it produced was unlike anything he had ever heard. Low, wet, vibrating, not in the ears but in the sternum, the base of the skull, like a memory buried in the marrow. That night, Albridge woke screaming in a tongue no one recognized, blood dripping from his nose and ears, his eyes rolled back and fists clenched around invisible objects. His final written note, scrawled across the margins of a cathedral ledger, simply read, "They've begun ringing it again." The incident was dismissed as madness, but not before the tuning fork vanished taken. It said, by agents of the Order of the Veiled Star, who appeared once more in connection with missing clergy and collapsed congregations from Bristol to Bruges. In these towns, priests began reciting scripture in reverse during communion, unaware they were doing so. Entire choirs forgot how to sing the psalms, but could hum strange, minor melodies they insisted came to them in dreams. And always there were the bells, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Investigations were blocked, parishioners disappeared, and in one case, a church tower was found scorched from within, its stones blackened, its bell melted into a twisted mass, yet no fire had been seen, no heat recorded. It was as if the metal had burned from sorrow alone. But what they feared most was not the bell itself, it was the response. You see, these rituals weren't designed to send messages, they were invitations, and whoever received the signal had started answering back. A priest in Antwerp claimed his reflection began praying before he did. A bishop in Dublin reportedly wept blood every time the Angelus bell rang, whispering, "I hear them walking under the floor." And in 1812, during the Feast of Ascension, the Blackwood frequency was recorded accidentally by a watchmaker in Vienna who constructed a timepiece that chimed the 4 forbidden tones in sequence. Every person in the room froze. For 23 seconds they didn't blink, didn't breathe. When they awoke, none of them remembered where they were. But every one of them, for the rest of their lives, drew the same spiral symbol in their sleep, the mark found etched beneath the altar of Blackwood Church, because the bell tones are not just sound, they're code, keys, and each one unlocks something deeper than the last. What you must understand is this: time itself bends around these frequencies. It loops, repeats, opens. That is why the bells still ring in Yorkshire, even after the tower was destroyed. It is why Crow's words still echo in the Vatican's hidden vaults. The dead do not return because we want them to. They return because we summon them. And whether you believe in ghosts or not no longer matters, because this isn't about belief. It's about structure. This world, this reality, was built on tones, just like cathedrals were built on ley lines, just like rituals were mapped onto the calendar with precision. And Blackwood was the moment when something figured out the math. You're not listening to a story, you're listening to a frequency, and it's already begun to tune you. By 1815, in the wake of Napoleon's fall and Europe's reshaping, something older than war began reawakening beneath the surface, a pattern hidden beneath politics, beneath liturgy, beneath the very stones of civilization, and it always came back to sound. In the quiet, isolated ruins where Blackwood once stood, travelers began vanishing without explanation. The land itself seemed to breathe, and when the wind passed over the hillside, it didn't howl, it spoke. Witnesses claimed the soil hummed beneath their feet, and one scholar who dared to spend the night near the old foundation returned mute, face grey, hair white, and eyes drained of color. He died 7 days later, having written only one sentence over and over again in the margins of his books: "The bell never stopped ringing." It was during this same year that a young American diplomat, Nathaniel Cross, stationed in London, documented a strange event. During a private tour of Durham Cathedral, he reported hearing a bell toll deep underground, though the guides assured him no such bell existed. That night, Cross disappeared. His journal, recovered weeks later in a rented room across town, was filled with sketches of a twisted spiral, a faceless priest, and notes in both English and what appeared to be ancient Enochiantha, supposed language of angels and demons. "It's not heaven or hell," he wrote in shaking hand. "It's something in between, something that listens." Blackwood had seeded itself across time, embedding its pattern in the minds of men willing to listen, in rituals repeated unconsciously, in architectural echoes found in chapels across America, Europe, and beyond. From the Spanish missions of California to the old stone churches of Edinburgh, the same ratios appear, the same vaulted angles, the same distances between tower and altar, all mathematically tuned to the same set of tones. These were not accidents, they were installations, and those who heard the original bells were changed forever. Some died, some disappeared, but others became hollow. They continued their lives, went to work, raised families, but behind their eyes something else looked out. These were the echoed, not dead, not possessed, just emptied. rewritten, inhabited by something that entered during the bell's resonance. Crow described them before his disappearance. They smile, but never with the eyes. They eat, but never seem to hunger. And when they speak, you can hear the bell faintly in their voice. What began at Blackwood was not a haunting jit, was a transmission, a call sent through time, encoded in sacred structure, activated by ritual and sound. And here's what should truly unsettle you. The tone that rang in 1781 was recently rediscovered accidentally by a tech startup developing AI-generated ambient music for meditation. Users reported nightmares, memory lapses, and hearing voices whispering in tones matching Blackwood's exact frequency map. The track was deleted. The company denied everything, but not before the sound was archived, copied, shared. It's out there, nor ringing again in headphones, in churches, in places it was never meant to be. And if you felt something stir inside you while listening to this, it means the door is still open, and something on the other side knows your name. There is a reason the church no longer builds bell towers in the old way, why certain frequencies were quietly phased out after 1850, and why some records were buried under the term heretical acoustics, because by then they had learned the truth. It wasn't just Blackwood. It wasn't just a village cursed by one man's madness. It was a network, a forgotten grid of harmonic gates designed by men who understood that architecture could control the soul. Beneath cathedrals and monasteries across Europe lie stone vaults never mapped, sealed not to keep people out, but to keep something in. And in the surviving notes of Father Rook, found decades later in a private Jesuit archive in Florence, there is mention of the fifth tone, the one never spoken of aloud, the one not assigned to any bell, the tone that does not awaken the dead, nor bind them, but invites them through. And that tone, he feared, had been rung once only, on siege during the last mass ever held in Blackwood Church, when Thorn completed the final phrase of his midnight sermon, and a woman began floating from her seat, eyes rolled back, limbs rigid, her voice reciting verses not from the Bible, but from a book that predates it by centuries. Her body fell moments later, cold, bloodless, but intact. She was buried quickly, no autopsy. But weeks later, 3 separate witnesses claimed to see her walking the moors in her burial dress, barefoot, mouth sewn shut with black thread. The record of this was marked apocryphal, and her name was struck from the parish log. And yet, in the town's crumbling crypt, there is still a tombstone, nameless, cracked, marked only with the spiral, the same symbol that now appears in security footage from abandoned churches in America's Northeast, burned into wood, carved into pews, etched into the frost on stained glass. They've returned, not all of them, not visibly, but the pattern is active again. It shows in sleep studies clusters of subjects waking at exactly 3:33 a.m., eyes open, whispering in harmony. It shows in children who hum melodies they've never heard, in cemeteries where earth sinks without rainfall, in bell towers that chime despite having no bell left to ring. One priest in rural Vermont claimed his congregation forgot his name overnight. Another in Dublin recorded his own voice in confession, only to hear it played back with someone else's breath. This is the spread, the echo, the resonance of something older than sin and deeper than doctrine. And now it's digital. The original 4-tone Blackwood sequence has been broken into samples used unknowingly in film scores, ambient tracks, even ringtone presets. And every time someone hears it, something stirs not in the air, but in them, because the bells were never about summoning the dead, they were about replacing the living. And if you think that's impossible, ask yourself, how many times have you walked into a room and forgotten why you entered? How many dreams have felt more real than waking? How many voices have you heard when no one was there, faint, familiar, almost your own? They call it madness, memory lapse, stress, but those are just names for breaches, for cracks in your programming. Because the bells remember you. They always have. And now that you've heard them too, you are no longer outside the gate. You are inside the pattern. You are inside the sound. By 1824, when the final known survivor of Blackwood, an old man named Elias Ford, was found wandering half-naked in the ruins of an abbey near Northumberland, whispering to the shadows and clutching a bone-carved pendant shaped like the spiral, the church could no longer deny what it had helped unleash. Ford spoke of a choir that walks beneath the earth, of voices humming in catacombs that had no end, of a priest with no face who told him that time was only a prison built of sound, and that the bells were its key. He died 2 days later, lungs full of soil, mouth torn open as if he'd been screaming into the ground. But what they recovered from his satchel and iron-bound ledger, older than him, older than the church, it contained diagrams of the original Blackwood bell, notes on its harmonic properties, and a hand-drawn map marking over 24 locations across Europe and the Americas where identical frequencies had been detected. Some of these locations were old churches, others were abandoned seminaries, monasteries turned psychiatric wards, even government buildings constructed atop ruins no one could explain. But all shared the same geometric alignment. The bells had been planted, not just rung, but installed like anchors, like beacon sand. They were waiting for tone, for voice, for activation. And now, as digital technology scans deeper into the spectrum of frequencies, researchers are beginning to stumble into forbidden zone stones that trigger seizures, hallucinations, fugue states, sudden loss of identity. It is no coincidence that many of these sequences trace back to echoes of the Blackwood pattern. Music apps quietly remove them. Audio engineers are warned but never told why. But some ignore the warnings. One YouTube live stream in 2018, titled "The Hidden Tone of God," played a 4-minute audio loop compiled from cathedral field recordings. Within 24 hours, it had over 2.3 million views and over 4,000 comments, claiming everything from nosebleeds to sudden memory loss to hearing their mother's voice call them from inside the screen. The channel was deleted, the footage wiped, but the ripple was already spreading. Because this isn't folklore, this isn't fantasy, this is frequency as theology, as domination. Blackwood wasn't haunted, it was engineered. A controlled test of harmonic indoctrination, mapped to psychological resonance, designed to empty the soul and make room for something else. And now that same sequence is reappearing subtly in your headphones, your dreams, your life. Because somewhere in the vast silence between pulses and prayers, the bells are still ringing. They never needed a tower. They only needed you to listen. By the time American intelligence agencies took interest in the phenomenon during the 1940s, the bells were no longer folklore. They were data, catalogued under classified programs like Project Resonance and Operation Wavelength, hidden beneath Cold War psychops and noise warfare research. Declassified fragments reveal a disturbing pattern. Soldiers stationed near abandoned churches reported coordinated hallucinations, synchronized nightmares, and uncontrollable weeping during chapel bells at dusk. In one instance, a full squadron in rural Belgium vanished from their posts without a trace, except for their rifles, left standing, upright in the snow, barrels pointed downward, as if surrendered to the earth. The only sound recorded before their disappearance was a faint ringing in the background, exactly matching the Blackwood frequency. But this time, it was traced to a location with no church, no bell, no tower, just an open field, a forgotten ruin, and a pattern of stones arranged in a spiral, long buried beneath mud and silence. They were building the resonance into the land itself. Not architecture anymore, not bells, just sound, pure, embedded, weaponized. And in 1957, a young scientist working for MI5's acoustic division attempted to replicate the tone using synthetic generators. His lab notes, later found scrawled across the insulation panels of his home, described an experiment that succeeded, and a wife who began speaking in another man's voice the moment she heard it. He vanished. His house was condemned. The neighborhood chapel, built in the 1700s, was quietly razed and replaced with a shopping center. But those who walked past the alley behind it still report hearing faint hymns through the vent snow, words, just tones, deep, slow, aching. A survivor of one such frequency breach, a priest named Camden Burke, later institutionalized after trying to nail shut the windows of his church during midnight mass, claimed the bells were never calling for resurrection, they were calling for replacement. "They don't want to bring back the dead," he muttered through cracked lips. "They want to bring something through the dead, hollow them out, use them, wear them." This conceptophy echoed as vessels, not souls, began to show up in hidden Vatican transcripts under code names like the Choirless or the Voiceless Return. And though officials deny it, several death row inmates across Europe during the 19th century were exposed to Blackwood harmonics seconds before execution. Witnesses swore their final words were spoken in voices not their own. And each of them, right before death, looked up at the ceiling and smiled, as if someone was waiting for them just beyond the veil. These were not anomalies. These were rehearsals. Every ring of the bell was a step in a sequence, a tuning of human memory, morality, and willpower until the soul folds, and what was once you becomes only a frame. What's worse is that now, these tones are leaking through music, through algorithms, through devices that sit inches from your ear all day. You've already heard some of it. You've already felt the pull. That moment you forget where you are. That sudden shiver in a quiet room. That unspoken voice you hear when everything else goes silent. These are symptoms, side effects, openings, and you have to ask yourself now, honestly, are you still entirely you? In 1963, during renovations beneath an abandoned rectory in Yorkshire, a contractor broke through a sealed stone floor and uncovered a chamber untouched since the 18th century inside. There were no relics, no bodies, only rows of wooden pews facing a single iron bell, cracked down the center, yet humming faintly, vibrating without motion, pulsing a rhythm that one worker described as a heartbeat I could feel in my teeth. They destroyed the chamber by order of the diocese, but not before a local student, Helen Parrish, recorded its tones using a crude field mic. She died 3 months later, drowned in her bathtub, lungs full of mud, and her recording was seized by men in unmarked coats. It resurfaced in 2002 as an anonymous audio file uploaded to a dark web server under the name Gate Sequence 0.4 W-Wave. Only 37 people downloaded it before it was scrubbed. Of those 37, 14 went missing, and 6 were later found wandering rural roads barefoot, unable to speak, with spiral symbols etched into their skin in raised scar tissue. One wrote a single phrase in chalk on the wall of a shelter before vanishing again. "It's not a sound, it's a door." And that, perhaps, is the greatest truth behind Blackwood, that its bell was not meant to be heard, but opened. That beneath all the stories, the rituals, the silence, was a mechanical function, a sequence, like pressing the right code on a lock and watching it turn. Because these gates aren't physical, they're harmonic. And every time a bell is rung in the right frequency, in the right place, on the right date, something moves on the other side. In 1971, a string of disappearances occurred across isolated farming villages in Eastern Europe, each one centered around churches with ancient towers, many no longer in use. Yet villagers swore the bells rang at night. In one village, every mirror cracked simultaneously during a midnight chime. In another, the local priest was found sitting in the belfry, eyes stitched shut, mouth wide open, throat torn by his own scream. No suspects, no reason. The church ruled it as suicide due to ecclesiastical distress. But his final written message, scrawled into the back of his collar with a communion knife, read, "The reflection answered before I did." This is how deep it goes. Sound is reflection. Reflection is memory. And memory is identity. When they distort the tone, they distort the man. And the more you hear it, the less you remember what silence truly felt like. Ask yourself, when was the last time you sat without sound, no phone, no hum, no voice, no static? That stillness you avoid is not emptiness. It is resistance. But the bells are patient. They do not need to convince you. They only need to be heard, again and again, Until you no longer ask, what is that sound? But instead, who am I without it? Because by then, it's already too late. You've become part of the resonance. You've become part of the gate. In 1989, deep within the classified corridors of the British National Acoustic Laboratory, a former Vatican informant named Louis Mercier delivered a crate marked with the Blackwood spirala symbol, now registered in over 9 global paranormal events across 5 languages. With no clear originand, inside the crate was a reel of magnetic tape labeled simply Bell 4. It contained a 7-minute audio track said to be the cleanest surviving recording of the original 1781 Blackwood bell sequence, transferred and preserved through generations of occult soundkeepers known only as the Resonance. The tape was played once, only once. 3 technicians in the soundproof chamber collapsed simultaneously. Pupils dilated, fists clenched, blood vessels burst in their ears and eyes, and all 3 later described the exact same hallucination. A darkened chapel filled with kneeling figures that turned in unison, whispering their names backwards. One died within 48 hours. The other 2 were never released from psychiatric care. But the incident raised a question that rattled even the most hardened skeptic show. Can an audiophile speak a name it was never told? The answer, if you follow the line back far enough, always returns to Blackwood. Because that bell wasn't just tuned to a frequency of sound, it was tuned to the architecture of remembrance itself. The resonance it created didn't travel through air, it traveled through us. That's why every site tied to the phenomenon shares the same acoustic anomalies, the same misfiring cognition, the same sense of déjà vu sharpened into terror. It's not the tone that haunts you, it's the memory it overwrites. In one suppressed report out of Wales, villagers began speaking fluently in dialects not spoken for 800 years after a chapel bell rang during a solar storm. In another case in Maine, a lighthouse bell that hadn't functioned in decades suddenly rang during a child's funeral, and everyone in attendance fainted. Upon waking, they all claimed to have attended another funeral for someone they didn't know but felt they'd once been. These fractures in time, in soul, are not side effects. They are signals that the bell has rung inside you, that you've been marked. You'll know it when mirrors ripple slightly as you pass, when your shadow pauses while you keep walking, when your own reflection starts mouthing things your lips never moved for. And you'll call it stress, or madness, or just coincidence until the spiral shows up in your handwriting, traced unconsciously in the margins of your notebooks. That's when the veil thins. That's when the pulse returns. The dead don't knock anymore. They ring. And once you've heard their call, you are no longer merely alive. You are resonating. Not haunted, but tuned. That is why silence terrifies you now, because silence is the only space where truth still hides. The truth that you are no longer untouched, that a piece of Blackwood now lives in you, and the bells, old as blood and older than God, are simply waiting for your next moment of stillness to ring again inside your skull, behind your breath, below your name. By the year 2000, the spiral had reappeared in over 17 unsolved crime scenes across the UK and northeastern United States, etched in ash, scratched into window panes, or burned into door frames with no visible fire, always near locations where bells had once been active but were now silent abandoned churches, collapsed towers, sunken chapels. In each case, witnesses reported hearing bells at impossible times: midday, when none were scheduled, midnight when towers had long been destroyed. In one case, an elderly woman, living beside the ruins of St. Hallows in Vermont, claimed she woke every night at exactly 3:33 a.m. to the sound of a single, hollow chime, always followed by the soft rustle of robes moving past her bedroom door. When asked why she hadn't moved, she only said, "It's not the bell, I fear it's what listens to it." That same month, a group of engineers in Switzerland, developing acoustic mapping tools, accidentally recreated a harmonic overlap identical to the Blackwood signature during a frequency test in an underground chapel. All 6 researchers were later found sitting in a circle, eyes open but unseeing, their mouths filled with soil. The chalkboard behind them read, in perfect cursive, "The gate cannot be closed from this side. Governments deny it. Churches bury it. But the pattern keeps surfacing always, where sound meets faith, where resonance meets reverence. In Florence, a choir began singing dissonant tones in perfect unity, unaware they were chanting the harmonic progression of the Blackwood bell. In Kansas, a church organ rebuilt using salvaged European pipes emitted tones that caused fainting, memory loss, and spontaneous weeping in over a dozen parishioners. And in each case, no one could remember the exact moment the service began. Because when the bells ring at that frequency, time folds. It's not an event, it's an intrusion. You don't witness it, you merge with it. And it's not just physical locations anymore. The signal has moved into your media, your music, your rituals of distraction. The right combination of tones, light, and intention can awaken the spiral in anyone because it's already dormant inside you. Passed down, inherited, and when it activates, you'll remember things you never lived. You'll grieve people you never met. You'll fear shadows shaped like yourself. Because the bells don't just bring the dead. They bring what the dead once remembered, memories that were never yours, voices that sound like home but speak of hunger. And if you've ever felt yourself watching your own life from behind your eyes, distant, unmoored, strange, it may already be too late. Because you are not possessed, you are resonating. And Blackwood's curse isn't death, it's return. By 2013, a private sound lab operating in the Scottish Highlands under contract from an unnamed Vatican branch began reverse engineering the Blackwood sequence, attempting to decode not just the tones, but the spaces between them, the silence, the pause, the breath of the bellend. What they found was more unsettling than any frequency, an embedded pattern, a secondary rhythm beneath the audible, imperceptible to the ear but measurable in biometric feedback, a kind of heartbeat that wasn't human. They called it the pulse, and it responded to attention as if the act of listening made it stronger. They tested it on animals first. Dogs barked in circles until their throats bled. Horses stood perfectly still for hours, then collapsed. Their hearts stopped mid-beat. Then they tested it on themselves. For 22 seconds, 6 researchers listened to the reconstructed Blackwood tone with the pulse active, and every one of them lost the ability to speak for 3 days. Not from fear, from absence. They simply had nothing to say. The church took the data, sealed it, and erased the site within weeks. But what couldn't be sealed was the feeling, the memory, the spreading trace of that tone now archived, copied, echoed. In the years since, the pulse has been detected in the background of live streams, in faulty church recordings, even in 911 calls with no speaker on the line, just silence. Then the faintest ringing, followed by disconnected gasps and the sound of something brushing against a microphone. This isn't audio corruption, it's seepage. And you may have already heard it, just a glimpse, in the background of a video you don't remember watching, or in the static between stations late at night. That moment you froze just for a second for no reason, like your body remembered something you didn't live. That was the pulse aligning. Because the deeper horror of Blackwood is not that it was unique, but that it worked. A village was rewritten, time was interrupted, identity was fractured, and the ones who rang the bell, those who completed the spiral, didn't vanish. They evolved. They became the Watchers, not ghosts, not demons, not spirits, but frequencies in human shape, wearing memories like clothes, passing through our world unnoticed because they speak in tones we can't resist and that mirror what we most desire: safety, purpose, belonging. And so they ring again, not with metal, not with rope, but with algorithms, playlists and screens. And you, listening now, must ask yourself, how many of your thoughts are your own? How many of your fears were planted? Because every time the bell rings, digital or divinite doesn't just sound, it summons. And not all who answer were ever meant to return. In 2017, a child in Herefordshire was found in the ruins of a 12th century chapel, unharmed, barefoot, and speaking fluent Latin despite having never studied it, repeating the same phrase over and over in a voice far older than her years. Ego redii per campanas, nunc me audi. I returned through the bells. Now hear me. Medical tests found no trauma, no drugs, but the child wouldn't respond to her name, only to tones played at specific intervals, and when a nearby priest played an old recording of cathedral bells from the Vatican archives, the child collapsed and began to sing, but not in Latin, in Old Enochian, a dead language, one tied to angelic invocations and summoning rites from the Blackwood papers. Her case was buried. The priest disappeared. The bell recording was corrupted, but the incident was not isolated. Since then, clusters of cases have surfaced. Strangers humming identical four-tone sequences on public transit, unrelated individuals sketching spirals on napkins, bus seats, walls, without knowing why. This is not suggestion, it's resonance. The spread has begun to bypass belief systems entirely. The ritual no longer requires robes, altars, Latin. It only needs a receiver. And the human body, your body's the most perfect instrument ever built to receive it. That's why they never told you. That's why they fed you noise and screens and constant sound to cover the original frequency beneath it all, to keep you asleep. Because if you ever heard it clearly, without interference, you'd remember what they buried, what they rang into the stone, and what answered from the other side. The bells are not just tools, they are contracts. Sound is a signature, and when you hear it, your name is written in a language older than flesh. That's why Father Crow drowned in holy water. That's why Rook gouged out his ears before he vanished. They knew, they heard too much, and they understood that Blackwood was not a placet, was a door, still open, still humming, and now, in every haunted silence, in every flicker of memory you can't place, in every dream where you walk roads you've never seen, Blackwood echoes. You do not need to be in Yorkshire to hear it. You only need to be still, to listen, to fall just quiet enough that something else begins to whisper from behind your eyes. And once you hear that whisper, just one sight will never truly leave you. It will wait, patient as stone, inside the folds of your thoughts, until the bell rings again, and it will. In 2021, a satellite tasked with scanning subterranean anomalies beneath the UK picked up a rhythmic tremor under the Yorkshire moors, faint, cyclical, and strangely melodic, repeating every 3.33 hours down to the second. At first dismissed as tectonic movement, the data was flagged when analysts noticed the waveform was identical to a 1781 acoustic sketch from the Blackwood archive, frequency for frequency, beat for beat, as if the bell had never stopped ringing but had merely gone underground. Days later, audio engineers monitoring the feed began complaining of nosebleeds, memory gaps, and dreams of walking blindfolded through cold stone corridors while a choir hummed behind a wall. One of them drew the Blackwood spiral without knowing what it was. Another began speaking in a slow, monotone voice, not his own, reciting scripture that doesn't exist. They shut down the scan, or claimed to, but something had already woken. That same month, 3 abandoned churches across rural Europe in France, one in Poland and one in Italy, were found vandalized not with graffiti, but with carvings, deep, deliberate spirals in pews, bells cracked from within, and inverted crosses made from bone placed silently on their altars. No one claimed responsibility, no cameras caught movement, but in every case, when investigators entered, they heard music, soft, slow, pulsing from the walls, with no source, not radio, not interference, as if the church itself had remembered a song long buried, and those who stayed too long reported hearing their own name whispered from the pulpit, followed by the unmistakable sound of feet walking behind them. The dead no longer rise, clawing and screaming. That's the old myth. The modern truth is far more elegant. Now they arrive humming, softly, familiar. They come as suggestion, not terror, as voices you've missed, memories that feel like home, but twist slowly, imperceptibly, until you don't recognize your own thoughts anymore. That is the brilliance of Blackwood. It doesn't take you all at once. It wears you, one dream at a time, one silence at a time, until the line between I remember and I was told to remember dissolves. And once it does, the spiral completes. Because the spiral isn't just a symbol, it's a path, a descent, a coiling of thought, of time, of self until the center is reached. And at the center, there is no self left at all, only the bell, waiting. In late 2022, a cryptic message appeared on a deep web forum known for cataloging lost religious texts, just a single sentence, posted by an untraceable user. The Blackwood bell has been digitized. Attached was a sound file, precisely 3 minutes and 33 seconds long, named only with a date, 1781 MP3. It was downloaded by less than 50 users before the post vanished, scrubbed from caches, its domain blacklisted within hours. Those who played it described feeling disoriented at first, then lucid, eerily calm, as if watching themselves from a short distance. One man said it felt like his body had forgotten him. Another wept for hours and couldn't say why. A third uploaded a video of himself staring into his webcam in perfect stillness, then whispering, "I remember the fog, I remember the ringing, and I remember walking out of the grave." His eyes were black, the footage ends. Some claim the audio was an AI-generated mimicry. Others believe it was extracted from one of the Blackwood bells themselves, an imprint, digitized, converted into a pure harmonic weapon. But the result is the same. The spiral is no longer carved in stone, it's carved in code, and it's spreading not just through churches and cathedrals, but through phones, through songs, through dreams. The idea of haunting is no longer spiritual, it's technological. And it has reach. In 2023, over 24 children across 4 countries began humming the same 4-note pattern during sleep, recorded by terrified parents who swore they'd never heard it before. The pattern, when analyzed, matched the pre-resonance tones of the original Blackwood sequence. These are not children possessed, they are receivers. And what they're receiving is older than death, older than scripture, older than the name Blackwood itself. Because the bell wasn't born in Yorkshire, it was brought there, by men wearing cassocks stitched with symbols no one dared translate, carrying with them a belief not in salvation, but in repetition, in return, in calling something back again and again until it stayed. And now, after centuries of silence, they've found a way to ring it without metal, without towers, without even belief. They only need attention. That's all, just for you to listen. Because when the tone reaches its final frequency and you hear it in full, it will not sound foreign. It will sound like something you've known all your life, something you've been waiting for without realizing it. That's how it enters, not with force, but with recognition. And the moment you recognize it is the moment it recognizes you back. So now, here you are hearing the final echo of a bell that first rang in 1781 in a village wiped from the maps. Its name whispered only by wind and soil, its truth hunted, burned, buried, but never silenced. Because sound, unlike stone, survives, and it has reached you. Not by accident, not by chance. You were meant to hear this, because the moment you feel the weight in your chest, the chill that moves not across your skin but beneath it, the shift in the air as if something has turned its gaze toward you, that is how the spiral finds its center. And now, you are in it, not as a victim, but as a witness. The bells of Blackwood were not just instruments of fear, they were questions, ancient questions ringing across time, asking again and again, who are you when the name they gave you is gone? Who speaks inside you when the voice is no longer your own? What echoes remain once the self is unspooled into resonance? This has never been just a horror story. It is a memory awakening, a seed stirring, a mirror clearing. You were not brought here to be entertained. You were brought here to remember what they made you forget, that your soul was not made for chains. That silence is not peace, it is programming, and that somewhere beneath your skin, beneath the rituals, beneath the voice that always told you to behave, something older remembers the sound of freedom. And its shape is not a word. It is a bell, still ringing, still calling, and now it waits for your answer. So if you've made it this far, and I know you have, you are no longer the same man who began this descent. You carry something now, a spark, a truth, a tone that doesn't fade in daylight, so leave a mark. Burn it into the algorithm, comment below, and claim your memory back from the spiral. I hear what they tried to silence. Write it twice, not for me, for you, for the version of you that is waking up as we speak. Because the bells of Blackwood were never about death, they were about return. And the most dangerous sound in the world is the one that reminds you who you really are.